I am thrilled to be able to moderate this panel with two people who I, as many of you did, grew up reading. Have had the honor to spend more time with as I've gotten more active in this world. And I think who have a really important perspective to share. As we've talked about in the description of this session, the freedom, what we're calling freedom conservatism, has had its ups and downs over history. If we attach it to the conservative movement that the two gentlemen to my right helped build over the last several decades. Maybe we start with you, George. When you were a young tyke, was it National Review where you had your first gig as a writer?
Yes.
And what was it like back then? Did you feel like you were winning?
No, we did not feel like we were winning, and A, because we weren't, and B, because there were factions at National Review that disapproved of me because I had said something rude about Spiro Agnew, who was, I went to work for National Review in January 1973, and the exact week the Judge Sirica's draconian sentences caused the Watergate cover-up to break. And there was a certain kind of conservative who really didn't like Nixon until it was clear he was a crook, and then they rallied around him. But in 1973, National Review was still faction-ridden, uncertain of its identity, and without the confidence that came with having an articulate leader like Reagan.
Was that part of what made it fun? Was all the debates that were happening internally in the pages, or was that frustrating that there wasn't a consensus around?
It wasn't unfun. I mean, it was a lot of. I might be the only person in the room who actually cast a vote for Barry Goldwater. So losing 44 states gets your attention, and so there was a sense of ferment that we were on, if not yet the winning side, the rising side, which I think.
What made it the rising side? What was it that allowed the freedom movement to rise?
Buckley made conservatism fun and almost chic, and Reagan made it forceful. In 1952, Whittaker Chambers publishes Witness, which became a canonical text. Now, he had a flair, to say no more, for self-dramatization. But he did say in that, I think it's in Witness, that he said, when I left the Communist Party, I knew that I was leaving the winning side, going over to the losing side. Perfect rubbish. In fact, this is the winning side, always has been and always will be. It just takes a certain understanding that in the phrase American conservatism, the adjective does a lot of work. European conservatives, throne and altar, blood and soil, all that stuff. American conservatives want to conserve the American founding, which locates them broadly in the Enlightenment principles, broadly as the legatees of classical liberalism, and that's all about freedom.
Jonah, when you're not writing about your dogs and your wife, you spend a lot of time on this topic, right? The tensions between classical liberalism and maybe Burkean conservatism, how the U.S. has kind of mashed them all up together. How would you observe the evolution of that tension over time?
First of all, delightful to be here. Thank you for having me. That tension, is built into Western civilization. That's the argument of fusionism, right? It is not simply that, there's a lot of cheap intellectual history and punditry that says, well, the old Reagan consensus, the three-legged stool, that fusionism was merely a coalitional building idea. It's just wrong, right? The ideas inherent in fusionism are that this is a tension that runs through the human heart in Western civilization, that it is as much of a tension as Athens and Jerusalem are in Western civilization. And if you go back and you look at all these foundational books, like ISI would keep reissuing this collection of essays. It's gone under different titles, but it's basically what is conservatism. And it features a whole bunch of different writers and intellectuals who are duking out the fundamental tension within that tradition, which is, we can call it freedom versus order, liberty versus virtue. These are all different facets of that same tension. And one of the things that, sort of picking up on where George was talking about, one of the things I've always loved about conservatism up until recent events is that the right actually cared about arguments. The essence of conservatism was about having arguments. And one of the reasons why it could have interesting arguments is that it was perfectly willing to admit its dogma, right? Everybody has dogma. Everybody has certain fundamental philosophical, metaphysical assumptions about the world. The difference between conservatives and a lot of progressives in the tradition of going back to William James and American philosophical pragmatism is that we don't lie to ourselves. We say, hey, look, here are these things I value: liberty, virtue, order, take your pick. And we're willing to acknowledge that these principles will sometimes be in tension with others of our principles. The essence of Burkean thought is just simply the idea that any good principle can still be taken too far. And so it's a balancing test. And where I agree entirely with George is, look, there are a lot of these post-liberal, integralist, ultra-trad, Catholic, nationalists. I mean, it's a big, weird soup of people, and some of them are very, very smart. Some of them aren't. And but a lot of them are trying to make something, a lot of them have basically this sort of Harry Potter-like understanding of intellectual history, where they think if you could just convince people that John Locke was wrong, then sort of like if you convince people that the math that works for planes is wrong, then the planes will just fall out of the sky, right? If you can just convince people that John Locke was wrong or that the Enlightenment was wrong, then all of a sudden America will be perfectly fine with being some ultramontane, post-liberal integralist state. And the simple fact is that this is a liberal country in the classical sense. Our left is still very, very liberal, and our right is still very, very liberal. The language is very, very liberal. As Mansfield at Harvard would put it, it's like almost all of our debates are about rights, which is a very liberal way of thinking about things. And freedom is a transpartisan, nonpartisan, appealing thing for Americans because Americans like freedom. And the politicians that can frame issues in ways that appeal to that usually succeed, even when they're what social scientists call lying. And so, I thought it was very funny during the rise of this post-liberal stuff. So this is sort of when Sohrab Ahmari was at Sohrab 3.0. I can't keep quite track where he is now, but he was making the case that this new right could tap into the populist, anti-corporate, anti-medico-industrial state or something like that in order to translate that populist fervor into a post-liberal Aristotelian state aimed around the highest good. And I always loved the image of Sohrab going forth to preach Thomistic theory of statecraft to bikers for Trump. Right? And yes, we are now that we've won, we're going to ban pornography, right? And we're going to bring back Sabbatarian laws, right? This idea that there is a huge constituency in this country for autocracy, for serious statism, is a mistake that the left has made for countless times, and now we see a lot of people making it on the right, too.
Let's take I think one thing I always try to do is take the strongest arguments of the other side and interrogate them. And the strongest argument, in my view, of the anti-freedom conservatives on the right is whatever you want to call them, whether they're the national conservatives, the so-called new right, they're really the old right. Their argument is that after the Cold War ended, and we got complacent, and we said free trade is wonderful, but we outsourced all the jobs to China, and blue-collar workers got left behind. The libertarians were in charge of culture, and as a result, families broke down and communities have faltered. What do you make of those arguments, either of you?
Well, it seems to me the primary agenda of freedom conservatism is negative in one sense, and that is to resist the temptation that is a party perennial in politics for totalizing politics, for a unified field theory of politics that answers all questions and gives you a kind of intellectual Rolodex where you can get all the answers in one swallow. Let me give you my unified theory of politics. Why do we have politics? Trout don't have politics. Bees have hierarchies, queen bees, drones, but they don't have politics. Beaver cooperate in making dams. We don't talk about the politics of beaver. Human beings have politics because of two things. They're opinionated and egotistical. They have opinions, and being egotistical, they think theirs are best, which is why they pick them. So the first job of politics is to keep the peace among people. And one way you keep the peace is by saying politics is not going to deal with the big questions. Now, young people particularly want a politics that deals with the big questions. They want all the answers. But it seems to me one of the things freedom conservatives want to do is say, fine, quest for meaning all you want, but don't find it in politics. I mean, there's something really disorienting and unlovely, and at the end of the day, vicious about people who say politics is a source of meaning in life. Politics, to begin, is to keep the peace. Some people say, no, politics is to have an idea of the ultimate good and pursue it. And I would hope freedom conservatives would say, well, that's a good thing to do after you've ascertained the worst and figured out how to avoid it. Lord knows we've had enough in the 20th century examples of what the worst in politics can be. And therefore, before we go riding over the hill in pursuit of the best, let's just make sure the worst is tamped down.
Jonah, do you feel that conservatives were complacent about outsourcing of jobs and the decline of the family?
I think they were more complacent about the outsourcing of jobs than they were about the decline of family. I mean, I was at National Review for 20 years. We ran quite a few pieces about the decline of family.
I remember.
And this is something that, conservatives, social conservatives and otherwise have been talking about for a very long time. I don't think we can, whatever the problems with families, and there are a lot, they're overdetermined for a whole bunch of different reasons, blaming the libertarians seems very strange to me. The Cato department chair of undoing the family has been vacant for a while, and but on the outsourcing the jobs thing, I think there's a perfectly fine practical argument to be made that bringing China into the international trade order was oversold, and the results were disappointing on the terms that they were sold on. I want to have one caveat on that. People constantly will say that experiment failed. And all I can tell you is my position is you're right so far. It is not obvious to me that China won't be moving in a liberal democratic direction in 30 or 40 years or in 3 to 5 years. I don't know. But this idea that it's just obvious that it's going to be an autocracy that rules the 21st century, I think is really kind of hubristic and silly. We should plan on that as a matter of national security, but that's a different matter. Where I think my problem with the people who make that argument, and you're right, that's basically the best steel man argument, right, is part of the problem is, look, I spent most of my life, professional life, arguing that Friedrich Hayek was right about the knowledge problem. And the argument about the knowledge problem is simply that experts can't know enough to outsmart the economy, to be better than a free democratic liberal democracy and markets at the allocation and distribution of services and goods. And this was fundamental dogma on the right? For most of my life, if George was writing a column about conservative economists, he was also writing about libertarian economists, right? I mean, Milton Friedman and Tom Sowell, these guys, there was very little distinction between a conservative economist and a libertarian economist because we basically had one bench for economics. And all of a sudden, in the last 10 years, you have a whole bunch of people say, no, you don't get it. the problem with social engineering and social planning and economic planning is that the progressives did it. We know how to do it because we're just so much smarter, right? And I love the headline on the Marco Rubio op-ed where he says, why I'm for industrial planning but done right. It's like, oh, no one mentioned that. Like, oh, if industrial planning is done right, then of course it'll work, right? And so I think that the reason why I have skepticism towards the people who are making all the arguments that you're describing is that they want to take over the federal government and run everything essentially out of the White House. And I always want to ask these people, if you're so convinced that your system of your alternative non-liberal or post-liberal system is better, why not start with Rhode Island? Why not start with Muncie? Pick some municipality where you can get like 80% buy-in from the people and put your ideas to the test. And it turns out that no, what this really is a pretextual argument for power, more than it is an actual serious argument about an alternative. Because there are very few new ideas, and most new ideas are really stupid. And so that's one of the conservative insights is that that there's very little that's new under the sun, and
In politics.
in politics in particular, but in general. Irving Kristol once said that the essence of neoconservatism is the application of social science to prove that your grandmother was right. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And so, yes, politically, I can criticize the Republican Party, how it sold a lot of this stuff. That's fine. But we're not here talking about freedom Republicans, right? We're here talking about conservatism as a sort of larger intellectual project. And I just find most of the criticisms of the pre-2015 conservatism to essentially be nearest weapon to hand arguments more than actually serious and sustained critiques.
George, I saw you nodding your head when he was talking about China. What do you think are the mistakes, if any, that conservatives made in the post-Cold War era?
I don't think there were big mistakes. To me, the most astonishing thing about the China shock is how small it was. And you can almost make an argument it didn't happen. Ross Perot said that you're going to hear a great sucking sound from the NAFTA agreement as jobs are sucked out of the economy. We lose more jobs in the sense of churning in a normal 18 months of American economic dynamism, which is a good thing, than we lost to NAFTA. And the China shock accelerated something that is a universal occurrence in all developed societies, which is the decline of manufacturing as a key source of employment, largely because of productivity increases. And the fact that it now takes 1/10 of the man hours it used to take to produce a ton of steel is a good thing, unless you really wanted to work near the open hearth furnaces in southwestern Pennsylvania, which most people didn't, including the people in southwestern Pennsylvania. Energy in the executive. That's what a lot of conservatives want. Well, we got it. Is everybody happy? Front page of the New York Times last Thursday, the lead story, above the fold, front page, columns 5 and 6. The President of the United States, head of the executive branch, one of the 3 branches of one of our many governments, had decided that he was going to put an end to congestion pricing in the southern portion of Manhattan. Now, part of the challenge for freedom conservatives is you have to say no and can't do this and simmer down. And people don't want to hear that. No to totalizing politics, which has a tremendous human appeal through the ages. No to anything that violates what Hayek called epistemic humility. There are lots of things we can't know. And no to the progressive idea of the presidency, which we've got right now, which is Congress is backward and inefficient and not nimble. The president's job is, to use Woodrow Wilson's phrase, interpretation, to interpret what the country really wants but isn't quite clever enough to articulate. And therefore, the way to govern is through executive fiats. We got it. Is everybody happy? Not exactly. And we're going to have what Mr. Trump is doing is he's bringing to a rolling boil a simmering argument for the last 100 years about executive power. And the fact that executive power always, inevitably, is at war with epistemic humility.
What in both of your careers would you say is the point at which you felt most pessimistic about the future of what we now call freedom conservatism? When did you feel the most optimistic?
I'd say mornings, most pessimistic.
You're watching Morning Joe, or?
I would say, I have to say, I generally try to do a happy warrior thing. I'd say I'm most pessimistic about it now. Speaking of happy warrior, I used to, back when I was in better odor on the right, I used to give a whole happy warrior speech for right-wing think tanks, annual dinners, and all these kinds of things, where I would say, be happy warriors, because you're on the right side of the most important issue there is, which is freedom and liberty. And you are actually on the side of not only the best, but the only anti-poverty program that has ever worked at scale, which is liberal democratic capitalism.
This is literally the speech I gave this morning.
Yeah, okay. So there you go. It's a big chunk of the last book I wrote, which I know the title makes it sound like I'm telling you to take a bath with a toaster, but it's actually a pretty upbeat book, despite being called Suicide of the West. And part of the point I would always make is, look, you will always be outnumbered. Because most people, getting to George's point, most people are confused about politics. They practice what Albert J. Nock called Epstein's Law. They just want to take the shortest path possible to whatever they want. We are wired to think that a big man, a leader, can solve our problems for us. Most of us, one of the fundamental category errors in politics is that, and it's a mistake that the left always makes, the right only occasionally makes, and now it's making again, and libertarians never make, which is that the government cannot love you. It cannot be your mommy or your daddy, it cannot be your tribe or your church. Government is government. And I said, but it's okay, because be a happy warrior because you are outnumbered. So I'm used to that feeling. I'm just not used to being outnumbered on my own side. And the number of people on...
Do you really think you are outnumbered on your own side?
Maybe not among voters, maybe not among, the remnant, which there's a reason my podcast is called that. Maybe there is a large, untapped army of normies out there. I think there are a lot of closet normies still on Capitol Hill. But there's never been a moment in my lifetime, maybe George can point to a moment, during the brief Nixon parentheses, the last New Deal president, but there's never been a moment on the right where you couldn't make the case for free markets and limited government, where if it proved inconvenient or embarrassing to one politician, you were deemed, as the Amish would say, shunt, right? You were sort of excommunicated. And that cult of personality level is very dismaying to me that it's on the supposedly conservative side. I think there's a yawning gap these days between what it means to be right-wing and what it means to be conservative, and it's getting bigger. And this tension of populism versus conservatism has always been there on the right, always. We've just never had populists so dominant in the coalition that they can literally police the speech of conservatives. And that's very dispiriting for me at times. I'm going to spend the rest of my career just cleaning up to get back to where some of these ideas that were commonplace on the right are once again part of the consensus in a certain way. And that way, a lot of you guys should be happy warriors then, right? Because it's a good fight. It's the only good fight when it comes to politics, is fighting for this stuff. And if you like the fight, that's great. I just thought I'd be fighting the left for the rest of my career. And now I feel like, what is it Chesty Puller says when he's surrounded? It's great, now we can fire in every direction. That's sort of how I feel these days. And There are days where I lament that I've lost a lot of friends, and there are days where I take it as a matter of pride. But it's a new sensation for me.
An opportunity to make new friends, perhaps.
Perhaps.
George?
The government can't be your, what did you say?
Can't be your mother, can't be your father.
But it
can't
can
love
be
you.
your friend. When Franklin Roosevelt, weeks after his inauguration, a few days after, in 33, gave his first fireside chat, his first two words, they don't appear in the transcript at Hyde Park, but he said them. The first two words were, "my friends." Imagine George Washington saying, "my friends," to people. People didn't want the government to be their friends. They wanted the president to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. But mass communication, radio, which I think has been more influential than television and the internet and all those, radio is the fundamental transformative technology to bring new intimacy between the governed and the government. People look now to the presidents to be their friends. And in some sense, they're saviors. I've never been called a human sunbeam, but
Maybe you need to talk to more people.
That George Will, he's a hugger.
I'm a short-term.
When you signed the Freedom Conservative Statement of Principles, it was like a sunbeam for all of us.
I'm a short-term pessimist, but a long-term optimist. I think I know Newtonian physics is out of fashion since quantum mechanics took over, which I don't understand, of course. Someone once asked the great physicist Eddington, "Is it true that only 3 people understand quantum mechanics?" And there was a long pause, and he says, "I'm trying to think of the third." But Newton's right, equal and opposite reactions. The physics of our politics is going to work 4 years from now. I know political prophecy is optional folly, but here we go. 4 years from now, we're going to have a much more circumscribed presidency, and there's going to be a kind of vestigial spine on Capitol Hill. It's just going to work. People are going to be tired of being humiliated. People are going to be tired of the collapse of the Madisonian equilibrium of our constitutional architecture. And things are going to get better because they get worse. Now, I know that that's dangerous. The German Communist Party said, as Hitler was about to take power in 1933, they said, "Nach Hitler kommen wir." After Hitler will come, meaning that Hitler would so intensify the contradictions of capitalism. Well, they did come in the form of East Germany eventually, but the price was rather high. But still, I do think there is a sense in which after this, Madison makes a comeback.
Feel free to line up for questions for George, Will, and Jonah Goldberg, but let me ask you a last question before we go to Q&A. We have an enormously high-powered group in this room who are trying to advance these principles. What's your advice for them about how to do it, how you guys did it in your time, and you're continuing to do it today?
First of all, be cheerful. And one reason to be cheerful is that we know the other side's going to fail. We know free trade works. We know industrial policy doesn't. Look, Donald Trump is the designated progressive paladin of the downtrodden. Let's take automobiles for just a second. People are now keeping their cars longer because it's cheaper to repair them than it is to buy a new car because government has created inflation that raised the cost of car loans. But along comes the progressive defender of the downtrodden to say, we're going to put tariffs on cars from Mexico. Now, 70% of the cars sold in the United States that cost under $30,000 are made in Mexico. And by the way, you who are keeping your cars because it's cheaper to repair them, we're about to have tariffs on automobile parts. Everything's going to go wrong. It's a society, epistemic humility yet again. Society is like a Calder mobile. You jiggle something here and things wiggle way over there. And it doesn't work, the other side. Now we have to periodically go through these little learning spasms, but they're coming. And on the other side is going to be another period of understanding.
I think George Hegel once said that the one lesson of history is that we never learn the lessons of history.
That's correct.
We have to
That's
keep
right.
repeating those mistakes.
But we learn them. We learn them over and over again.
Exactly.
And there are intervals of of enlightenment.
Yeah, so I have a very similar take. I mean, there are very few issues I disagree with George on, so it shouldn't be surprising. But, Edmund Burke says, example is the school of mankind, and he will learn it no other, which is it's a fancy way of saying sometimes you have to show people, you can't just tell people. I think Ed Koch said it better when he lost his bid for, I think, a third term as mayor of New York. He was asked if he was ever going to run again. And he said, no, the people of New York fired me, and now they must be punished. and so the part of the lesson here is, and I say the same thing that George was saying all the time, is have a certain amount of confidence that your positions are actually correct, and that in the fullness of time, their correctness will be demonstrated. There's a lot of essentially intellectual and political corruption going on, which says that people need to change their ideas because they're not popular anymore. Well, if they're true, they'll eventually be popular again because they're going to be the remedy that gets you out of the mess that is coming. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't be open to new arguments and new facts and all the rest, but that's the thing is, particularly for young people, there aren't that many young people in here, but like the advice I give them, well, a few, but the advice I give them is, let me put it this way. One of the things I resent most about this period is that I was the kind of guy for most of my career who the responsible grown-ups would say, Jonah, maybe you should calm it down a little bit. Maybe reel it in, right? Maybe saying that, when Geraldo, I only want to use the Geraldo joke. When it's saying that when Alan Dershowitz took Viagra, he got taller, right? Like maybe fewer of those kinds of jokes, right? And now all of a sudden, I'm the guy who's like wagging his finger and sounding judgmental and saying, it's really important to have integrity and all that. And I resent the role. But having integrity really, really matters. The fundamental essence of intellectual life, of journalism, and all the rest, most journalistic ethics are BS. And the ones that aren't can basically be summarized as, do not say or write things that you do not believe to be true. And we live in a moment where an enormous number of people are lying. And some of them know it, and some of them really resent having it pointed out. When Pete Hegseth said, I'm going to write my LA Times column about this today, but when Pete Hegseth said yesterday, today's the 3rd-year anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine, and when Hegseth was asked, can't you just say that, Russia invaded Ukraine? He said, well, it's complicated. And it's not complicated. Russia invaded Ukraine. What's complicated is the climate in which it is really difficult for someone like him to tell the truth. And so my advice in all of your dealings, whatever fronts you're on, is tell the truth. You don't have to tell every truth, you don't have to, but don't lie. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which again is a pompous guy for me to quote, but he has this great line where he says, you can resolve to live your life with integrity. Let your credo be this. Let the lie come into the world, let it even triumph, but not through me. And if you want to be ready for when the opportunities come, when the now they must be punished moment comes, you need to have credibility, you need to have consistency, and you need to have integrity. And that moment will come, and that will persuade a lot of people when they need the persuasion. So that's be my advice.
Great. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the really powerful words just now from both of you on integrity. I wanted to return to the topic of the executive becoming increasingly powerful, and it's not a new debate, as you all pointed out. Arthur Schlesinger wrote about it in The Imperial Presidency, tracing the increase in executive power throughout the 20th century, and the 21st century has been just like a ratcheting up exponential increase in it, especially the past several administrations. This is specifically to you, George, Will, about your confidence that it will change. I'm curious what your reasons are for really believing that it will, because it hasn't, and because I think historical precedent across the world would more likely indicate that executive power would spiral even further out of control than that it would get checked. And so are there precedents we can point to that give you confidence where you can say it has been done and this is how it could look? Or do you have specific confidence in our system and how our system could be that check?
I wouldn't say that we're ever going to get back to anything like the presidency that we had until the coming of mass communications, which, by the way, included the railroad, because the railroad enabled these guys to go out and be seen everywhere. But I would say this. Before Donald Trump discovered that he could do everything he wanted by executive order, there was Barack Obama, who had a phone and a pen, and who, having said 20 times by actual count that he had not the power to do what he then did about DACA, the Dreamers, he went and did it. And before that, we had George W. Bush, who issued more signing statements, that is, announcing there were portions of laws that he was not going to enforce because he thought they were unconstitutional, than all 42 of his predecessors combined. He was exercising a kind of line item veto, which the Supreme Court, he did not notice, had said you can't have. Before that, there was, of course, Woodrow Wilson, who thought the executive could be nimble and act with dispatch in a way that Congress couldn't. Before that, there was Teddy Roosevelt, who had the stewardship theory of the presidency, which is the president's free to do anything he's not explicitly forbidden to do. So he intervened in the coal strike in Pennsylvania, and the modern presidency kept getting born. But long before that, the seventh president was known as King Andrew, because he said, look, I'm the only one. He was the first president who wasn't connected really to the founding generation. And Andrew Jackson said, I'm the only one here in Washington who's here because everybody wanted me to be here. If you weren't women or black or, all the other people who didn't have a say in that. So this is a timeless problem. When Harvey Mansfield wrote a huge book on the executives called Taming the Prince, Cy Prakash at the University of Virginia has written two books on the presidency. One is Imperial from the First. The other is The Living Presidency, the problem of, as he put it, caging the executive lion. When you have an administrative state, and we're going to have one forever, people have made this decision, you're going to have a problem with the executive power. But I like to think, this is the sunbeam in me leaking out, I'd like to think that when Trump sent up Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Gabbard and Patel and Hegseth, he was trying and succeeding in humiliating the senators, saying, you don't want gets, try these. And he did it. He got away with it for lots of interesting reasons. But I do think that people are tired of being humiliated. And they're all, I'm sure as we speak, they're all reading Federalist 51. Where Madison said we see throughout our system the process of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives, and the interests of the person must be connected to the powers of the place. That is, the Congress is going to, I think in some way, it's not going to happen fast, it's not going to be dramatic, it's not going to be total, but there's going to be a revival.
Tell us your name and affiliation, by the way. Let's get everyone introducing each other.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Price, and I'm actually here as a fellow with the Hertog Foundation.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Next. Drew, introduce yourself.
Hey, Drew Klein with the Josiah Bartlett Center in New Hampshire. To put it simply, freedom conservatism, the essence, is restraint of government power. Populism's essence, simply, is the use of government power.
Yeah, we can barely hear you. Maybe get
sorry.
Closer to you.
Yeah, I
or
got to
speak
get.
up.
There we go. Sorry. Freedom conservatism, the essence is restraint of government power. Populism's essence is use of government power. We're on a century-ish long project of the left taking over every institution that it gets hands on and converting it to its own ends. The populist enthusiasm expressed for Trump was, but he fights. The you don't know what time it is argument to us is You guys failed. You didn't protect us from the progressive project to take over the federal government, to take over institutions all throughout the country. Seems to me that is the core of populism's moment right now. And I just wonder if you could respond to that. When you hear that argument that, look, guys, we get it, but you got to use government power because it's the only way to win. We're tired of the left using it against us. We want to use it against them. How do you respond to that?
So first of all, I think it's important to concede that many of the descriptions of the problems of the left are real, right? The long march through the institutions is real. We got to this point circa 2019 or so where the 2020, where the stated position essentially of universities was you would go in for punishment or rehabilitation or re-education if you said men can't get pregnant, but if you said gas the Jews, well, that's a free speech issue and everyone has a right to their own opinion, right? And that's a mess. And so my level of sympathy for what's happening to universities is very, very, very low. That said, first of all, it is not true that conservatives never won anything. One of the best ways to realize that people are suffering from a certain amount of delusional paranoia is the fact that both sides of the culture war think the other side always wins. They can't both be right. And the conservative legal movement was a massively successful movement. Gun rights are more secure and expansive today than they have ever been probably in American history in some respects, certainly in the last century or so. And you can go down a list of, first of all, we're also wildly richer than we were just 30 years ago. When the EU sort of came together, they basically had a bigger GDP than we do, and now they're like, we're 1.5 times their GDP or something like that. And so there have been successes and there have been failures all over the place. The question is, directionally, I have a lot of sympathy for Doge and some of the things that Elon Musk wants to do. I just think, getting back to my point before about telling the truth, I think the surest sign that your position is weaker than you think it is if you feel the need to lie about it. And he's said an enormous number of things that just are factually untrue about their successes and whatnot. He kind of, one of my favorite phrases is reads like a sophomore. There's a certain kind of person, Glenn Beck is a great example of this, old friend of mine, where he discovers something that he didn't know and assumes no one else knew it, right? Musk finds these things in government and says, no one knew this until I discovered it, right? And the reality is there are like 35 websites that have documented this information for 30 years. And so I think part of the response to that is to say, stop catastrophizing, right? It wasn't as bad as you think it is. I think one of the things that has really messed up our politics is the degree to which both sides think that if they lose this election, America is over. If you think we're one election away from America being over, America's already over. My last name being Goldberg, I don't normally talk about Christian theology, but the reason why despair is a sin is because it's the notion that you are beyond even the powers of God to find grace. And that's just not the American experience. America has abused the rule of law and the Constitution many times in the past. George and I are he's probably in first, I'm in second place for having written about a guy named Jacob Majed, who was sentenced to jail for charging a nickel less to press a suit in the New Deal. These things happen and we learn from them and we self-correct. But the right had to do that Flight 93 election nonsense, in order to create a permission structure to say it'll be the end of America if we don't win this election and if we don't give Trump all the powers that we want him to have. And that was a nonsense argument, and it's still a nonsense argument.
In the 80s, when I was raising my children, if they'd come and say, Daddy, can we do this? I'd say, yes, it's a free country, Mondale lost. It was my completely opaque way of telling them politics isn't that important. We don't put our basic happiness at issue in elections. Let me answer one more thing about
Yeah.
what gives today's populism its peculiar saliency and power is that it's not about material things. It is not about the Monongahela Valley. The fact is, there are economic complaints at all times in American life. I got that. It's the diploma divide that defines our politics. It is the allocation not of material goods. Anyone who wants a job in America today can get one. We have more than full employment. We're growing at 2%. But we don't have what's our real economy that's the problem is the economy of status. Mm-hmm. It's the feeling that they are despised. It's the feeling that college, and happily, one of the great developments of the last 4, 8, 9 years, again, this is Newtonian work, colleges have squandered their prestige, and that's a wonderful thing. You can buy a T-shirt that says college, those magic 7 years between high school and your first warehouse job. I mean, it's going to correct, I mean, you go to community college, you become a welder, you go to the oil fields in North Dakota, you're making more money, if this is material stuff, you're making more money than the average first year out of college Harvard graduate.
That's right.
The money, there's a great inversion taking place whereby people go to college and spend their 7 years studying gender studies, and they find out they're not equipped to add value to the economy.
For all the talk about blue-collar jobs, actually, we have a massive shortage.
Exactly.
Labor shortage right now for blue-collar.
And we're going to make it worse by deporting the entire construction industry in the United States, which is mostly illegal immigrants at this point.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Introduce yourself.
I'm Reed Howard. I'm with Future Caucus, an organization of Gen Z and millennial state legislators and members of Congress. I'm really struck by the comments you made about Buckley and Reagan, and I'm wondering if you think freedom conservatism maybe needs someone like Jonah Goldberg to make it chic and a presidential candidate to make it forceful. Do you think it has to come through a successful presidential candidate, or is there some other path?
And let me just add to that question. I mean, from history, since the theme of this session is what we learn from history, wasn't it Goldwater and Reagan at their heyday who helped create the modern conservative by running for president?
Yeah. I've often said Goldwater won. It just took 15 years, 16 years to count the votes. He changed the vocabulary. He changed the sense of what's popular. He changed the nature of parties, that we ought to have an ideological party. When I came to work on the Senate staff in 1970, the committee chairmen were Eastland from Mississippi, Stennis from Mississippi, McClellan from Arkansas, Sparkman from Alabama, Russell from Winder, Georgia. The entire Senate was run by Southern segregationists, still segregationists at that point. So things change.
I can't believe you have that right there memorized. That's amazing.
So just in case I misunderstood you or someone in the audience misunderstood you, if nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. And as Bill Buckley said, I will demand a recount if I win. So, but yes, I mean, I think your point is right, is that eventually you need a charismatic political personality to put the ideas in action, or in the case of Calvin Coolidge, in inaction. And that will come, right? I mean, this is something George has written a lot about, is like the ideas come first, the arguments come first, and then the leader comes and picks them up. And the issue right now is, I'm with George that eventually the humiliation of the first branch of government will have a stem cell therapy-like effect on some people's spines, right? But I suspect that the real answer is going to be some governor whose name we might not even know yet, who's going to come out and say it doesn't have to be this way. Maybe we can clone and have a younger Mitch Daniels. But yeah, eventually you need a charismatic political personality who grabs these ideas off the shelf and puts them into action. And that's the truth about Donald Trump, is like, what one politician can undo, another one can redo. But I just don't know who that person is right now, because there's a kind of Gresham's Law going on right now, and most of the really quality politicians are being chased out of politics and being replaced by a more coprophagic phylum of humanity.
Is it impossible that a Reagan-esque leader comes from the Democratic side, or must they come from a redeemed Republican party? And then I'll sit down.
You're the Scoop Jackson guy.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible that when they have the big shootout for the Democratic nomination in 4 years, the progressive majority will be fragmented, and someone could sneak through who actually likes the country. So.
My name is Carl Beckstein. I'm a big fan of Jonah's podcast, so I wanted to say a long-time listener, first-time caller. Jonah, thanks for covering the NatCons. You actually inspired me to read Patrick Deneen, 2 of his books, they were painful, but I read them side by side with Hayek. Mm-hmm. So my question for you is, as we're thinking about the FreeCon and NatCon debate, what authors, what thinkers, what books can help us better understand what we're for, but also be able to contrast that with the Deneen and the NatCons and why our side is right? Thanks.
Well, I mean, George's most recent book, unless you've snuck another one in under the wire that I've missed, is a good place to start. But, you know,
What's the title?
The Conservative Sensibility.
Yep.
And you know, Thomas Sowell's A Conflict of Visions, I think, is a useful place to start. I mean, let me put it this way: there are an enormous number of great conservative books that one can read, and essays too. I actually, if you're going to do Hayek and you're new to Hayek, I would start with The Fatal Conceit, not The Road to Serfdom, which is more of a political document than it is his best sort of analysis. But the real question is, if you're thinking about these things, is just try to take the team jerseys off and ask yourself, what would be my reaction if the left were using these mechanisms and these tools and these things to get what it wants? And what would my arguments be? And then apply that same calculation to what the populists are doing. I get very tired of listening to some of the sort of NatCon post-liberal guys talk about how the Constitution is a morally neutral document, and that it's mere proceduralism and it doesn't have moral content to it. The Constitution is a profoundly moral document. Like, the reason why liberalism emerges is it comes out of the wars of revolution, wars of religion, where literally people are being put to death because they believe they worshipped slightly differently, right? It's like, wasn't even like, same basic theology in a lot of ways, right? And yet they were killing each other over it. And liberalism emerges and says, we're not going to do that anymore. And if you think that, like, the right to face your accuser is amoral, if you think the right to a fair trial is amoral, if you think the First Amendment and the right to worship as you please and associate as you please is amoral, you have a goldfish memory of human history. And so I think that one of the things that is a more helpful heuristic than reading the right books, and I'm all in favor of reading the right books, including my own, is understanding that partisanship does not trump the fundamental arguments that define what it means to be a conservative or to be a classical liberal or anything like that. It's not, you can't argue that, well, if Republicans do it, it's okay. Either it's right or it's wrong, either it's an abuse of power or it's not. And that, cultivating that muscle memory is, I think, more important than any one particular tome to read.
Hey y'all, my name is Rebecca Staples. I am a consultant in Jackson, Mississippi, but I got my start with Haley Barbour, who George actually ran against Senator Stennis in the 80s, and his slogan was, a senator for the 80s, not in his 80s. So anyway, Haley lost that race, but won governor later. I feel like this might be just a replication of an earlier question, but I stood in line, so I'm going to ask it anyway. I was really struck by how y'all talk about government as a mom or a friend. And in Mississippi, many other places, community is so important. And as the first panel talked about the decline of religion and meaning, and I think, George, you referred to it as like government as a savior, or one of y'all did. I guess I'm just curious, how do you break that? How do you capture that audience? Your message doesn't seem like it's going to be effective if it's, hey, this isn't your friend, it's good for you, but, lose that sort of familiar element. How do you capture their attention so that you can lead toward a pathway of having freedom conservative leaders? So, thank you.
Well, one way you do it is you demystify the presidency. We have a kind of political alchemy theory in this country that you can make gold out of dross, and that 270 electoral votes transform someone into a statesman and a savant. If the consecutive 15 years of Trump, Biden, and Trump doesn't cure that, nothing will. The lesson of recent history is that any damn fool can be president, and a number of them are. So I think we're in the process of demystifying executive power, which will help. And the sense of that presidents don't care a lot about legality anymore is going to percolate through to the country. And when Teddy Roosevelt asked his Attorney General, man with the wonderful name Philander Knox, to come up with some arguments to justify in legal terms the skullduggery and general bad behavior that produced the Panama Canal, Knox replied, "Mr. President, we should not allow so great an achievement to have any taint of legality." I think legality is going to make a comeback also. The idea that there are certain things you just don't do. And with the help of the judiciary, of all the progressive short-sightedness in modern times, their recent attempt to delegitimize the Supreme Court and the Article III courts generally is at the top of the list, because that's all that stands between them and the rest of us and a rampant executive.
Yes, I would just add very quickly, the next step after demystifying the executive or even the federal government is to send as much power down to the most local level possible. And one of the reasons why we have this deformed political climate where people are looking to politics as a religion, I agree entirely with George that part of the problem is we have status disequilibrium, not financial. It's not a financial thing. It's what the economist Fred Hirsch called a positional good. Status is a positional good. If you have it, I don't. That's how it feels zero sum. And it's why he argued in the 70s that America can no longer promise a middle class, the American dream of a prosperous middle class anymore, because people are now defining their prosperity as being richer than their neighbors, and that's a problem. But anyway, the point is, you send power down to the most local level possible. You will still have problems. You will still have culture war fights, but the winners will have to look the losers in the eye. They'll see them at the store. They'll see them at their kid's soccer game. Second of all, they'll know who to fire, because the powers that be won't be these far-off, cold, impersonal forces, the globalists, the corporations, whatever. It'll be Ted and Nancy and Sarah and Phil, and they'll be accountable to the people that they actually live closest to. And this is something that I think that conservatives have been bad on. They've said the right words for a long time, but they've not actually been sincere about actually sending as much power down to the most local level possible, because they like having power when they're in power. And but that, I think, would heal a lot of the problems in our politics. Tip O'Neill's dictum that all politics is local is not true right now. All politics has been nationalized. And we're not going to get out of some of the problems we have unless we actually get back to a place where a lot of politics is actually local again.
Dan Mitchell. Javier Milei of Argentina, he hangs out at Mar-a-Lago, he goes to CPAC, but his governing style is completely different than Trump. He's cut government spending by 6% of GDP, his first year. Trump, of course, has been a big spender. I'm under the impression, maybe it's just a hope, that Javier Milei is a model that hopefully could have worldwide ramifications if he continues to succeed. And I'd be very curious to get both of y'all's reactions to that.
The American people are ideologically small government, operationally Hamiltonians. Musk posed an interesting arithmetical problem. He says, I'm going to cut 40% of the total budget from 17% of the budget. Now that doesn't add up. But when you know, Social Security and Medicare are untouchable. Both parties have explicitly said we will not deal with the obvious and largest domestic crisis in modern American history, which is our fiscal incompetence. Defense ought to be increased. The president says he wants to increase it. He hasn't notified his Secretary of the Defense about this. Service on the national debt, which is now larger than defense, isn't optional. Cutting the government spending is not going to happen.
Dan, I might take moderator's privilege to answer your question because thanks to somebody who's in this room, I got invited to attend Milei's inauguration a little over a year ago, and I took advantage of that trip to really investigate given that Milei's party didn't have any power in the Congress of Argentina, how much was he going to be able to get done? And what I learned was that there were some procedural quirks in Argentina that allow him to have more fiscal power than a U.S. president does, because the Argentine Constitution was based on the American Constitution, actually, but over the century or the decades of Peronism, the presidency assumed a lot more power in their system than the U.S. president has. And one of the tricks in the book, so to speak, that Milei used right away was there's this rule in Argentina that if the Congress does not pass a budget for the following year, the previous year's budget is automatically reset or redone for the next year. When the problem is when you have 100% inflation, that means it's an automatic 50% budget cut. And so he used that tool to basically slash the budget by 50%. We can't exactly do that here, and also a lot of our spending is not discretionary, it's mandatory, Medicare and Social Security and the like. So there's some things that Milei has in his toolbox that we don't have. Having said that, obviously we can all hope for the best.
Good morning, Greg Edwards. I don't have an affiliation, but I do subscribe to the Washington Post and the Dispatch. I want to push back a little on this topic of humiliation of the first branch of government. I'd asked George Will a question about Senator McConnell, who I think you have an insight into and a high regard for, which I share. Why do you think you voted for Kash Patel?
That's a good question. I'll ask him. During one of the candidates' debates among the Republicans, and Nikki Haley said Donald Trump is the most hated politician in America, I called Mitch and said, your title still is secure. People don't like Mitch McConnell because they say they hate politics. Actually, the country hungers for politics. And that's all McConnell is. The performative side of this is completely strange to him. But it's a good question on Patel, and since I'm the father of an FBI agent, I'm interested in getting the answer.
Good morning. My name is Stephen Hawkins. I'm with More in Common. My question is about Curtis Yarvin. To me, I've just become familiar with his work, presumably many of you have as well, and it seems to me like it's a broadening of the Overton window of what's appropriate to discuss in politics, with him rejecting the foundation of our country and the morality of the revolution, and arguing against democracy and for a kind of CEO/monarch to become the figurehead of the executive branch. He's been cited by J.D. Vance and by many of the Peter Thiel kind of world people. How seriously do you take his work, and do you think that the conservative world is ready to respond to it?
Curtis Yarvin. Okay, so I've written a bunch about this recently because I generally ignored him until his interview with, was it Ross Douthat? Rarely have I been so underwhelmed by someone so hyped. for those of you who don't know, he used to have this nom de cyber mendicis mole bug or something like that. And basically, remember before I said there are very few new ideas? The idea of a monarch, not particularly recent vintage. And his arguments are so absurd, right? I mean, his arguments are, well, and look, I agree with some of his like talking point stuff. It is true that democracy, where democracy is inappropriate, is bad. Marines don't vote on what hill to take, right? Employees at a company don't all vote on what the new product should be. Totally fine with that. But he takes it a step further and says, so democracy is bad in the areas where democracy is valued, and instead, because he's appealing to the vanity of Silicon Valley CEOs, he says, you know who should actually run the world? Silicon Valley CEOs. And you guys run things great, right? And we're seeing that management style right now on display with Doge. He says, look, Apple is so fantastic. Look how great all the stuff that Apple does. And it's a monarchy. That he's very unclever about all this, but he calls these things monarchies. The interesting question isn't how does Apple come up with good products, because there are a lot of corporations that come up with really crappy products, right? So it's not the model of having a corporation that guarantees a good product. It's how do you have a political system that creates companies like Apple? And liberal democratic capitalism is how you do it, right? And the idea that somehow if we could just have a chieftain or a monarch or whatever label you want to put on it in charge of everything is the epistemic humility problem on steroids. And so I kept waiting for it to be a more interesting argument than it was. And instead it was like one of these arguments that's so old, you kind of forgot the answers to it. But if you go and read The Federalist, you'll rediscover them. So I mean, I'm shockingly underwhelmed by his actual arguments. What I do take seriously is the fact that important people with influence take it seriously. And that's worrisome. But the actual arguments themselves are really underwhelming.
Thank you.
Great. Last question.
Hi, I'm John Cochran from the Hoover Institution and an enormous fan of both of you. So thanks for doing this. My question is, help me with a little loss of faith. I, like you, have for my whole life believed that power should be local, states, that Congress should stand up and take its own authority, things should do there. But I lived half of my life in Chicago and now half of my life in California, so I watch local and state government in action.
Why?
Because I live there. You know, in Palo Alto, Ted and Carol and Bob and Alice or whatever that George mentioned, when discussing how to, handle local development, they actually talk about cutting down trees being a problem for climate change. 4 trees in the city of Palo Alto. In Chicago, corruption is notorious. The retirement home for aldermen is the prison, and it's federal agents who always come and root that out, not local government. So, and let's not start on the California legislature. Local government currently is completely dysfunctional and often corrupt, even worse than the federal government. Congress is notoriously not doing a great job. Let's see, the Jones Act has been around for 100 years. Congress hasn't gotten around to doing something about it. Name anything you want. So first, help me on that faith that it would be desirable, because for all its problems, the federal government is actually more competent than the state governments of Illinois and California. Maybe more attention will help.
But we're changing that.
I hope so. But second, the mechanism. And I was prompted to stand up when Jonah said, send power down to Congress. No, Congress must demand power. Power is never sent anywhere. Power must be fought for and demanded back again, and perhaps that's the way it'll happen. So thank you.
I'll be very quick, and then so George can have the last word since this is the last question. I disagree with you that power has to be grabbed because Congress has outsourced its responsibilities to the executive branch and the courts for the last 100 years. The presidency under the Constitution does not have these trade authorities that Donald Trump is wielding, except for the fact that Congress has given them to the executive branch. I think this is one of the areas where the founders were wrong. I hate saying that. but they never would have dreamed that Congress would voluntarily abdicate their authority and their prerogatives to the executive branch. Congress is now basically a parliament of pundits where they would prefer.
And if I may, Congress should grab it back if we don't.
Yeah, I agree. They should grab it back. That requires, my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, Yuval Levin, wants to start a movement like the Federalist Society, but for rehabilitating Congress and the legislative process. So I agree with you. The Congress is, it's shameful how it gelded itself, and ungelding yourself is a difficult thing. That on the local level thing, I agree with you entirely, but one of the reasons why I think local government is so dysfunctional is because it has so little power. The things it has power over, it is very dysfunctional and it's very abusive on. But if you explain to voters that most of the decisions that are actually going to affect people's lives are actually now going to be made by local politicians, they would take local politics much, much more seriously. And so you have a chicken or the egg problem. Right now, I mean, you can talk about Jim Crow 2.0 and all that nonsense about Republicans and voters. The most anti-democratic forces of the last 40 years in terms of suppressing the vote have been public sector unions in places like New York and Chicago, who want very low turnout, because if it's very low turnout, the public sector unions have disproportionate control over the results. We need competitive parties in big cities. We need democracy and competition in big cities. And I think if you start sending power down to the local level, that will create the incentives that will start to emerge. But it's not going to happen overnight.
It was also, remember, local government excesses that provoked Madison to provoke a constitutional convention, which was to end things like local laws forgiving debts, and that sort of thing. So it was called Madison's nightmare, was local control. Madison is my pinup.
And by the way, people can move out of California, and many have joined us here in Austin, where I live.
Yeah,
So
federalism is working in that sense. But remember, congestion pricing is now a presidential matter. And undoing that, because every federal grant, every federal dollar comes with strings attached. And in most states, I think in 38 states, the largest budgetary item is Medicaid, which comes with enormous strings attached. So getting anything remotely like state sovereignty back is going to be a
generational
Sisyphean project. It's just going to be awful.
Well, on that optimistic note,
The sunbeams disappeared.
we'll bring them back. Thank you, George and Jonah. I really appreciate your time today. You honor us with your presence.